This is Saturn Girl. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. Comment below because I want to know what you think, and it helps me out with the algorithm. Anyway, today I wanted to talk about a subject that we typically find quite boring. Finance, right? But astrology has been used quite a bit in the financial realm for many years. In fact, J.P. Morgan, the famous robber baron, even said, what do you say? Millionaires don't use astrology, billionaires do. I mean, I don't know if that really works out that way, but it's a fun thing to say. So anyway, I wanted to talk about this because back in December of last year, your girl here made predictions. I usually don't make predictions because I don't want that stuff tied to my name. But I've been very, very interested in possible financial crashes because I'm doing a small business and I want this to work. So anyway, well, what were my predictions? Number one, I said that there would be some sort of financial crisis at the end of April. And we had First Republic Bank, actually the biggest bank failure since 2008, fail, collapse, right? I also predicted another crisis at the end of September, this month. So that's why I'm doing the video now, because I came up with this back in December of last year. And if this does happen, I do want to have this documented, okay? So I'm not hoping for it because it will screw me. But I think it's quite interesting to see these patterns, okay? So anyway, well, this is interesting to me because when I think of economics, I think of it as the study of how humans use resources. And it's ultimately based on social relations between people because they guide how things are produced and by whom and who gets those things. So, like I said, I don't normally make predictions. So how did I come up with these? Well, like I said, I got a hair up my butt to look at the astrology of the major financial crises in the United States because I'm a nerd. Don't tell anyone. Everyone's supposed to think I'm cool. Cool. Anyway, I shouldn't care if I'm cool or not, which makes me cool, right? Anyway, so I got a hair up my butt to look at the financial crisis astrology charts, whatever, over the past umpteen years. In fact, I started with the Panic of 1857. I went to the Panic of 1873, the Panic of 1893, the stock market crash of 1929 preceding the Great Depression, the 1973 stock market crash, the dot-com bubble, the Enron WorldCom scandal, and finally the COVID crash of 2020. And I found interesting patterns that sort of permeate through all of these things. Well, what are they? Well, first, before we get to there, we have to look at a very important chart. We call this chart the Sibly Chart. It's actually the chart for the United States of America. It's the birth chart. And it's the one that's commonly accepted in the astrological community these days. So the Sibly chart, pictured here, Sibly. It was named for a man named Ebenezer Sibly. Ebenezer Sibly was an 18th century, the 1700s, an 18th century occultist, an astrologer, and physician. And he became famous for casting this natal chart. I mean, he was famous for other things at the time, but this is what we remember him for his chart. My hair's still wet, so I left it down. I usually put it up because it looks like Spanish moss, like moldy Spanish moss. Anyway, so I have my hair down right now. But what about Ebenezer Sibly? So he cast this chart, and it was published in 1787. So it does use the familiar date of July 4th, 1776, for the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And the time used is about 5:10 p.m. You see, it was there were people present who claimed it was like around 5 p.m. or just after. So we typically say like 5:05, 5:10 or whatever. So this particular chart is at 5:10 p.m., which gives the US a Sagittarius rising, right? And it's so funny. People are like, well, that doesn't make any sense. I'm like, well, Sagittarius is the sign of fanaticism, religious fanaticism and stuff like that. So, if the bra fits. But we're not here to analyze the chart of the United States. We're here to look at financial crises. But there's some interesting things here. So, unfortunately, well, I say unfortunately, Sibly was a devout user of the Placidus house system. If you follow me, you know I do whole sign houses, right? But we'll just roll with, it doesn't really matter. We're going to use whole sign houses here. Sibly could do whatever the heck he wanted. So now there are astrologers who reject the Sibly chart. So for those of you who are interested in esoteric astrology, Alice Bailey, who wrote the book Esoteric Astrology, gives the US a Gemini sun and Aquarius rising. She doesn't ever say what the exact event was that leads to that, but she does assert that. So if you are into esoteric astrology, you might know that or might believe that. But I've seen the Sibly chart work quite well, especially with the financial crises, but other big events like Pearl Harbor, like 9/11. So anyway, but it's not our job here to analyze the Sibly chart. We're talking about financial crises. So anyway, I mean, look at this though, like the 8th house. I mean, that's sort of interesting. All that 8th house stuff. I mean, really, it is a stellium. The sun is 10 degrees away from Venus, but it's still a conjunction. It's wider than the Grand Canyon, but still a conjunction. So anyway, I think that's quite interesting, but we're not going to mess with that right now. So you will notice, though, that we're talking about financial crises and that the second whole sign house is Capricorn, ruled by Saturn in Libra here, exalted. And then the 6th house is enemies, injuries, illnesses, right? And that's Taurus here, ruled by Venus in the 8th house, right? The 12th house is self-undoing. It's also isolation and seclusion. And this is ruled by Mars in Gemini. And then the 8th house, right? The full 8th house here, where everyone's hanging out in the US's chart. The 8th house has to do with other people's stuff, other people's money. But it also has to do with credit, debt, and investment. Again, I think this is quite fitting. So anyway, what are some patterns that we'll see here with these charts, these financial crisis charts in the United States? Well, we'll often see Mars and or Venus ill-dignified, or in signs that don't make them happy. For those of you who don't know what dignity is, I'll do a separate video on dignity because I have none. So, boom, boom. So anyway, we'll see an ill-dignified or unhappy, right? In an unhappy sign. So for Mars, that would be Libra or Cancer, right? And then for Venus, we'd see her in typically either Virgo or Scorpio. But that's not a hard and fast thing. We'll often see that. More frequently, we'll see Mars or Saturn in hard aspects to natal Mars, Saturn, or Venus. But typically Mars and Saturn are the big culprits here, okay? So we'll oftentimes see Saturn in hard aspect to Mars or Venus, natal and transit. We'll see hard aspects of Mars to natal Mars or Venus in natal and transit. Mars or Saturn will often be in Cancer or Capricorn, right? Square this natal Libra Saturn. Okay. So we'll see. You see how these other cardinal signs are square or opposite? It's because we have a cross there. So anyway, the moon rules the 8th house. So sometimes she's involved too, right? You see the Aquarius moon here, the moon in very late Aquarius. And then occasionally Saturn and Pluto are involved, right? But, well, let's look at some examples of these, right? Well, here, let's start off with the Panic of 1857. So we're going to need to do a bi-wheel here. A bi-wheel is basically two charts superimposed upon each other. Like that. Oops, I need to I need to move that really quick. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Oh, left, 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 right, left, left, left. There we go. Okay, I'm so sorry about that. But you'll notice here the Panic of 1857. So just a little bit of history about this. It was primarily sparked by a railroad bubble. You see, at the time, railroads were booming and became highly politicized following the Dred Scott case, which I won't explain here, but was a very, very nasty thing. So there was a whole lot of money floating around, right? And people basically started capitalizing, making things called paper railroads, which were railroads that only existed on, you guessed it, paper. It was essentially like just a company with documents. They didn't have any actual hard assets, right? Well, what did this mean? Investor confidence began to wane, and a huge sell-off began in 1857. The economy would not recover again till the American Civil War, in fact. So, well, let's look at the chart here very quickly. Now, you might notice a very unhappy, oops, that's the wrong one. That's the wrong one. Bi-wheel. So, Sibly and 1857. There we go. So you'll notice then a very unhappy Mars there in Cancer. And a very unhappy Saturn. Because Saturn rules Capricorn and therefore is in detriment in Cancer. Now, Mars is exalted in Capricorn, so he falls in Cancer. So you notice these two ill-dignified, mean, malefic planets here making a square to the second house ruler, which also happens to be Saturn. So this is something that to me is very characteristic of these sorts of events. Now, you'll also notice that Venus here is trine Saturn. Now, you might say, well, she's not unhappy. She's in Gemini. She is conjunct Uranus, which makes things a bit uncertain. But I think it's quite interesting that she does make a trine to Saturn. Even though it's a trine, a so-called harmonious aspect, Venus is the ruler of the 6th house. And Saturn is still a malefic. So, but anyway, you see that. And so Uranus does come into play. We do see Pluto and Uranus sometimes involved. But the thing that I really want to get across are these aspects from Mars and Saturn. And occasionally from Venus, you see? Well, let's look at another one here. What about here? Let's go to the stock market crash of 1973. So the inner wheel, United States, and the outer wheel, the stock market crash. So you'll notice some things right off the bat here. Number one, Saturn is making an exact trine to Saturn. Well, let me talk a little bit about the history here. See, you see, 1971, the Bretton Woods global financial arrangement, which emerged after World War II. You see, it was an arrangement between the Allied nations. The United States basically became the financially dominant powerhouse following the war, and therefore mostly got to dictate the economic terms, which included countries being able to redeem their dollars in gold. In 1971, Nixon put the kibosh on that, mostly because other countries started asking for their gold. So Nixon's like, oh, I can't lose all the gold. Oh, what am I going to do? No more gold standard, right? So gold was no longer redeemable. So that system collapsed. Well, and there was also the 1973 oil crisis. So what happened then was King Faisal of Saudi Arabia imposed an oil embargo to stick it to the countries that supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. We won't get into all of that, but just suffice it to say, that's part of this history. So then what happened? Well, on January 11th, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is the basic metric of the U.S. economy right now. Well, I mean, it has been the Dow Jones Industrial Average, right? And then there's anyway, not going into all that. But suffice it to say, the Dow Jones Industrial Average reached a record high before it began its torturous, I don't know if that was record, but it reached a big high before it began its torturous decline, all the way through December of 1974. This was a very Saturnian sort of crash because well, let's go this way, because, see, everything's reversed in the camera. It's like, you see, Saturn stuff is very slow and protracted, right? So it takes a long time for Saturn things to culminate and work themselves out. So this was, this was a sizable thing. It was one of the biggest crashes since the Great Depression. The market lost 45% of its value. One of the worst bear markets, right? When the decline began, and notice Saturn here is retrograde. See that little RX down there? A retrograde Saturn in Gemini was forming an exact trine to natal Saturn. And you might be like, well, it's a trine. It's supposed to be happy, happy, happy. Saturn is retrograde. He rules the second house. And he's a malefic. And he's making an aspect to another malefic. The thing about trines is you can sort of think of them as a free flow of energy. Nothing is getting stuck. Ouch. Nothing is getting stuck at the square. I hit my funny bone. Ow. And now my hand's asleep. I guess they call that the stranger, right? Like, anyway. I'm not going to do that right now. Well, maybe not. I get in trouble. So anyway, retrogrades, what do they do? Reversals in fortune, right? Especially having to do with the house that they rule. And here's the second house. So to me, that's quite characteristic. Now, Mars, you see here, Mars was in Sagittarius. Now, Mars was approaching an opposition to natal Mars, right? Now, right now they're opposite by sign, which is a legitimate thing, especially in ancient astrology. But he is also approaching the degree, albeit like what? What? I can't do math 18 degrees away. I don't. But he's approaching the opposition. Now, Venus also enters Capricorn. Well, here, this same day, Venus entered Capricorn. She's here on the chart at 29:43. But she entered Capricorn that day, right? And was approaching a square to the natal Saturn. So these are sort of characteristic things that we notice. Well, how about the next thing? The next example I want to mention is the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which a lot of us should remember because it was 2008. For those of you With Pluto and Sagittarius, this may be like a dim recollection, but you may remember your parents griping about it. Well, let's go to that chart. So we'll go to a bi-wheel. A bi-wheel. It's my kind of wheel. I guess I'm a pan wheel now, because, you know. So the U.S. and the collapse of Lehman Brothers. So here we go. So what do we notice on this? Well, first of all, let's talk about the history. The prevailing narrative of the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the crisis of 2007-2008 is that a subprime mortgage crisis ignited this stock market crash. So lenders were essentially issuing predatory loans to low-income buyers. These loans were then bundled up and sold as assets called collateralized debt obligations, right? Pension funds bought them up. Other banks bought them up. Investors haphazardly bought them up. Excuse me. And then alongside that, derivatives were produced from those. So when the value of these assets began to crash, banks who had a lot of them were in big trouble. So other banks too, like Goldman Sachs, basically betted against these, right? So they took out these derivatives, which were, from companies like AIG, which basically were bets that these subprime mortgages would fail. Like they were betting on default, right? I mean, it's kind of sick because they made a whole shitload of money from this sort of nefarious nonsense. Anyway, so as I was saying, when the value of these assets began to crash, banks who had them were in trouble. I mean, not just banks, but pension funds. I had a friend at work who was an older gentleman who lost like 70% of the value of his pension fund. And yes, I used to work for the state of California, and we still had pension funds. So, I mean, they don't anymore. I don't think so. But anyway, so on September 15th of 2008, Lehman Brothers failed. Now, Lehman Brothers was one of the largest investment banks in the United States and had been a fixture in U.S. finance since 1847. Oh my gosh. See, young folks don't get how big this fucking was, I used to bank with Washington Mutual, who was lovingly known as WAMU back then. And they completely failed and were bought up by Chase Bank, right? So let's look at the chart here. We'll notice an unhappy Mars in Libra because Mars rules Aries and therefore is in detriment. He's not happy in Libra. In fact, he's in Libra right now. I've heard some UK friends call Libra Libra. I don't know if they were just effing with me, but So, a very unhappy Libra Mars conjunct that natal Saturn and what? And trine natal Mars. It's like a free flow of malefics. It's like, yeah! They be wilding, right? And I don't consider astrological aspects to cause anything. It's correlative. But I was about to say, they pushed it. So, but that's neither here nor there. So Venus, in this case, was also leaving a conjunction to Saturn, right? Now, this is a very happy Venus in Libra. She rules Libra. But again, remember that she rules the sixth house of these enemies and injuries, right? So she doesn't always do nice things for the United States. And if you'll notice here, there was also a full moon going on that day. A full moon that was square what? This natal Mars. So another sort of interesting anomaly. Now, one thing I also notice, a pattern, it was in 3 of these charts at least. 3 of, how many did I have total that I was? Now, we only focused on 3 examples, but I had a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 charts I went through. And nearly half of them also had an unhappy Jupiter in Capricorn. See, Jupiter falls in Capricorn because he's exalted in Cancer. So I did notice that quite a bit. And what else did I notice? In exactly 50%, 4 out of 8 of these financial crises, Jupiter was in Taurus, where he is now, and he's retrograde. So my spidey sense started tingling. So now I mentioned that I predicted some stuff that happened, right? And there we had the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, which was a big deal in March of this year. And then we had the collapse of First Republic Bank, which was also a big deal, right? In May 1st of this year. So now, when Silicon Valley Bank failed, it was essentially due to a liquidity crisis. You see, banks often keep a lot of their assets in very safe investments, like US Treasury bonds, right? Those are typically very safe investments. But what happened? Well, when they bought the assets, interest rates were next to zero. Money was so cheap, they were throwing it at you. I mean, not really, at rich people. you understand? And banks. So they bought up all these assets when the interest rates were super low. Well, then inflation blew out of control. And the Federal Reserve doesn't really have anything to curb inflation because they've lost all their memory of the 1970s. You see, President Richard Nixon, who Ralph Nader lovingly called the last liberal president, ironically enough, Richard Nixon imposed a wage and price freeze by executive order. Now, workers didn't like a wage freeze, but they sure loved the price freeze. And this helped both, especially workers, because it did curb inflation. Well, fast forward to now, and the Federal Reserve doesn't remember that. So the only thing they have to use is a hammer for a needle, right? Which is raising the interest rates. And raising the interest rates has caused lots of problems for people. It increases unemployment. And in this case with these banks, it decreased the value of their assets. You see, because now treasury bonds were having greater yields with higher interest rates. If you don't know what that means, I'm sorry. I don't really know much about finance. It's just this is sort of interesting to me. So now, when this happened, customers made a run on Silicon Valley Bank, right? A classic bank run. Like, for those of you who are older, It's a Wonderful Life. Jimmy Stewart, like, no, Mary, no, Mr. Potter, don't take my money. It's at Bill's house and Fred's house. Anyway, I love Jimmy Stewart. I'm a Saturn girl, so I know lots of black and white movies and TV. So I grew up on old movies and TV. You see, my dad went to Desert Storm for like a year, and my grandfather had us watch all old movies. And after a while, it's like the Stockholm Syndrome. You start loving old movies and TV. Like to this day, oh my God, Barbara Eden, I Dream a Genie, and Bewitched. Samantha. I mean, she's the mommy. Anyway, the world was a lot awfuler then. I mean, well, it's always pretty difficult, isn't it? Just depends on where you are and who you are. So anyway, you'll notice, let's look at the chart for this thing. For the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. Let's see. We gotta look at a bi-wheel again. So, the United States and Silicon Valley Bank. So here we go. Here's the chart for that. Now, you will notice a couple interesting things right off the bat, won't you? Look, transit Mars is pretty closely conjunct natal Mars, isn't he? That's pretty telling. Now, what else here? Saturn had been sitting on the moon, right? The 8th house ruler. Investments like treasury bonds, right? Saturn's here I'm going to start taking down the values of those investments. Saturn had been sitting on that moon for a while. because Saturn's a bit slower. And then we also have what? We have a very unhappy Venus, excuse me, in Aries, who's been leaving in opposition to Saturn. So, and then Saturn just entered Pisces, of course, which is the fourth house of the United States, representing one's foundation, one's security, and what? Generational wealth. So, now, I don't know if you could think about Silicon Valley Bank like that, but hidden wealth, hidden value, cryptocurrency. Many of the customers of Silicon Valley Bank dealt in cryptocurrency. And that was another anomaly here, as the crypto markets got really, really bad, right? I mean, there's been a couple crypto crashes, and the crypto bros keep trying to spout this stuff like, oh, crypto. Crypto's going to put you in the crypt. Oh. Anyway. Well, what about First Republic Bank? So after noticing all these patterns, I predicted a financial failure around the end of April. I noticed a specific aspect around April 22nd, and we'll look at that in just a second. But First Republic Bank failed right around that time on May 1st and was still suffering similar aspects, right, to all these patterns, and was suffering a similar fate to the Silicon Valley Bank. This was the biggest bank failure since my old bank, WAMU, during the 2008 crisis, right? When Washington Mutual collapsed. I was like, what happened to my bank account? All of a sudden I got a Chase card in the mail, right? So, anyway, I was in the restaurant biz at that time. Excuse me. So with First Republic Bank, well, let's go to First Republic Bank. We got to look at the buy wheel here. So First Republic Bank. Okay. Well, one thing you'll notice right off the bat here is a very unhappy Mars in Cancer, making a square to Saturn. So the day I picked for this event was April 22nd, when Mars was making an exact square to Saturn. But it's not always exact. You know, this often happens applying or separating, right? So we have to pay attention to these things. Oh, I just noticed the audio's off with my video. Oh, whatever. Anyway, moving right along. What else was going on? Well, Venus was conjunct Mars, wasn't she? And Saturn, where's Saturn here? Saturn was trine natal Venus. So even with some of these so-called good aspects, we see them aligning with these very difficult events. Well, when they contain malefics, you see? When they contain malefics. Now, why am I concerned about this? Well, because we have another event that I predicted coming up in September. Let's fast forward to that. Oops, I have to add that on here. September. And this is September, we'll call it the 22nd. September 22, 2023. And New York. New York. New York. Okay, now let's look at this bad boy. View and a buy wheel. United States. And then this chart. So anyway, now why did I pick this chart? Well, because a very unhappy Mars in Libra is going to be making a conjunction to Saturn. And that looks very ominous to me. So, Venus here, where's Venus? In Leo, will be sextile to natal Mars, right? And then Saturn will be trinatal Venus once again, right? So these three things together sort of gave me pause. Now, what else gave me pause? Well, there's some big events going on around this time, right? The US government hit its debt ceiling back in January. The American government has been sustained on a temporary spending bill called the Omnibus Bill. This has sort of been an allocation to keep the country going, right? To keep funding Medicare and keep funding Social Security and all these sorts of things. So, excuse me. Now, when this runs out, a government shutdown will happen if they can't come to agreements. And by they, I mean congressional Democrats and Republicans. So, if lawmakers don't come to spending agreements, it doesn't look good. You see, Republicans are sort of playing a game of chicken here that could have catastrophic consequences for the entire world. A U.S. default on its debt that is not making its payments, its obligatory payments, which we've already committed to, by the way, that could cause a global financial crisis like we've never seen. And it definitely would not bode well for the United States. I don't think anything that big will happen, but I do think that this will cause a bunch of problems. And I do think this will lead to a fairly big market correction. That's a euphemism for a crisis that's not big enough for them to call it a crisis yet. But I do think there's some significant things. So what else happened? Moody's. Moody's is a big old school financial ratings company, right? Like they basically grade the credit scores, essentially, or the credit ratings of countries, of banks, of all this sort of stuff, right? And Moody's downgraded the credit ratings of 11 mid-sized U.S. banks in August last month. They said the conditions that caused the bank failures in March, April, and May, Silicon Valley and First Republic, there were a couple others too, but these were the big ones. That those conditions were still a risk. Those conditions include the high interest rates, the liquidity issues, and things like less demand for office space following COVID, right? There's a bunch of useless real estate right now, or useless office buildings. So this credit agency, Moody's, said that customer bank runs could likely happen. And this is sort of what I see in September. So now there's a government shutdown, right? Coming up in October, possibly. Oh, we just talked about that. And we mentioned the worst case scenario, which I'm not banking on, no pun intended. I'm not banking on, but I just want everyone to be aware of it, right? This does look like some fairly ominous stuff. Now, the highlight here, the core, is the Mars conjunct Saturn. It's just icing on the cake that Mars is trine Mars and Saturn is trine Venus, right? And even these trines between these malefics, we've seen them still cause problems and been co-present in these charts of financial crises. So I hope some of this has been useful information for you. Please, please, please like and subscribe and share the videos. I really appreciate you watching till the end because it helps my watch hours, you know. And I know this is probably a boring topic for some of you, but I want this documented for posterity. So if anything does happen in September, they can be like, yo, Frankie, you were right. And it never gets old hearing that. You are right. Oh, am I? Oh, am I right? Oh, I had no clue. Anyway, I do wonderful readings. They are the best. It's science. It's been proven in scientific studies. So all my contact information is below if you want to book a reading. And I love you. You're beautiful. and have a wonderful whatever it is you're having.